you thought you were fumbling, didn't you? You thought those moments where you looked weak, where you looked lost, where you looked like you were making mistake after mistake after mistake, you thought those were accidents. You thought those were failures. You beautiful, calculated, dangerous chess player. Let me tell you something that's going to shift everything you thought you knew about your own story. Every stumble they watched, every fall they celebrated, every wrong move they whispered about behind your back. That wasn't weakness, that was bait. And they swallowed every single hook, line, and sinker until they choked on the truth. Welcome back, or should I say, welcome to the reveal. Because if you're still here watching this, you're ready to hear what you've suspected deep in your bones, but were too humble or too hurt to fully admit. You weren't losing, you were learning. You weren't breaking, you were building. You weren't making mistakes. You were making a map of exactly who would show their true face when they thought you were defenseless. And now that the dust has settled, now that the smoke has cleared, now that the game is over, you're standing exactly where you planned to be all along, while they're still choking on the bait they couldn't resist swallowing. Let's rewind this beautiful disaster, shall we? Remember when you made that choice? The one they all said was stupid, the one they laughed about in group chats, the one they screenshot and dissected like amateur surgeons with butter knives. Remember how exposed you felt, how vulnerable, how humiliated. Here's the secret. You knew exactly what you were doing. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with some master plan written in a leather journal, but somewhere deep in your survival instincts, you knew. You knew that choice would reveal who was really riding with you and who was just riding your coattails waiting for the crash. That mistake was a flashlight in a dark room full of rats. And they came running, didn't they? The concerned friends who weren't concerned, just curious. The family members who weren't worried, just waiting for gossip. The followers who weren't supportive, just spectators with popcorn. They thought you were spiraling, but you were sorting. They thought you were falling apart, but you were falling into clarity. Every person who reached out with fake sympathy, with thinly veiled judgment, with questions designed to extract information, not offer comfort, they marked themselves. They raised their hand. They showed you their cards. And you quiet, brilliant strategist, you took notes without them ever knowing you were paying attention. Here's what they'll never understand about people like you. Your mistakes weren't malfunctions, they were magnets. They attracted exactly what needed to be revealed. You didn't accidentally push people away, you strategically created space to see who would fill it with loyalty and who would fill it with poison. Those moments where you looked messy, where you looked uncertain, where you looked like you needed saving. Those weren't cries for help, those were tests. And oh, did they fail spectacularly. They failed so loudly, so obviously, so predictably, that looking back now, it's almost comical how easy it was to spot the fakes once you gave them the stage to perform on. But let's talk about the real masterpiece here, the thing that's going to make you smile in the dark tonight. While they were busy analyzing your every move, critiquing your every choice, diagnosing your every decision like they had degrees in your life, you were 3 steps ahead, doing something they couldn't comprehend. You were becoming immune to their opinions. You were developing antibodies to their toxicity. Every judgment they threw at you, every smirk they shared, every prediction they made about your downfall, it didn't weaken you, it fortified you. It built armor they didn't even know you were wearing until they tried to strike and realized nothing could penetrate anymore. They thought your silence was defeat, but it was strategy. They thought your distance was isolation, but it was elevation. They thought your lack of defense meant guilt, but it meant you stopped needing their understanding. Because here's the thing about bait. It only works if the fish is hungry. And you stopped being hungry for validation from people who wouldn't recognize real substance if it slapped them in the face. You stopped craving acceptance from those who only accepted you when you were small enough to fit in their boxes. You stopped explaining yourself to people who were committed to misunderstanding you no matter what you said. And That's when the real shift happened. The moment you stopped defending your moves, they lost their power. The moment you stopped explaining your choices, they lost their narrative. The moment you stopped reacting to their provocations, they lost their entertainment. And what happens when you take away a manipulator's supply? When you remove a bully's target? When you shut down a gossip's source? They spiral, they panic, they scramble. Because their entire identity was built on having you as the subject of their analysis, the center of their conversations, the reason for their group chats. And when you removed yourself from that equation, their lives became empty echoes of the meaning they thought you owed them. Let's get surgical about this, because you deserve to know exactly what happened. Every time you made a mistake that they noticed, you were actually conducting a social experiment. You were testing loyalty without announcing the test. You were measuring character without handing out rubrics. You were watching who would celebrate your falls and who would actually pick up the phone. And the results, the results were devastating in the best way possible. The people you thought were solid crumbled like cheap concrete. The people you thought had your back were already sharpening knives for it. The people you thought loved you were only in love with the version of you that made them feel superior. But here's where it gets beautiful. Here's where the bait becomes undeniable genius. While they were busy collecting evidence of your failures, you were busy collecting evidence of their character. While they were screenshot your vulnerable moments, you were screenshot their true faces. While they were building cases against you in their minds, you were building exits from their lives in reality. They thought they were exposing you, but you were exposing them. They thought they were winning, but they were doing exactly what you needed them to do, showing you who they really were when they thought you weren't strong enough to remember. And now look at you, standing in the aftermath of every trap they thought you fell into, realizing you were never in the trap. You were the trap. Your perceived weakness was the mechanism. Your apparent mistakes were the trigger. Your visible struggles were the bait. And they, with their arrogance and their assumptions and their desperate need to feel superior, they walked right in. They took the bait. They swallowed the hook. They let themselves believe you were drowning when you were actually just testing the depth of the water and the authenticity of the lifeguards. Let's talk about the specific moments they're replaying in their heads right now. The moments that haunt them because the truth finally caught up. Remember when you trusted the wrong person and they betrayed you, and everyone said you were naive, you were stupid, you should have known better. What they didn't see was that betrayal taught you discernment. They'll spend their whole lives lacking. That mistake of trusting made you wise in ways their cynicism never could. They thought you were the fool, but fools don't learn. Fools don't adapt. Fools don't turn pain into power. You did all three, while they were still laughing at the setup without realizing the punchline was coming for them. Remember when you stayed quiet, when you could have defended yourself, when you could have exposed someone, when you could have burned bridges with the truth. They thought your silence was weakness. They thought you had no proof. They thought you were just taking the loss. But you knew something they didn't. Silence is the most powerful response to people who need your reaction to survive. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was starvation. You starved them of the drama they needed. You starved them of the confirmation they craved. You starved them of the battle they wanted so they could play victim when they lost. And in that starvation, in that void you created, they revealed themselves completely. Remember when you made that choice everyone disagreed with? The relationship they said was wrong, the career move they said was risky, the boundary they said was too harsh. Remember how isolated you felt, how criticized, how alone in your conviction. Here's what they'll never tell you, because admitting it would shatter their ego. You were right. Not right in the way that made them comfortable, but right in the way that protected your peace. Right in the way that honored your truth. Right in the way that put your growth over their opinions. And watching you be right after they bet everything on you being wrong, that's a special kind of torture for people who measure their worth by being the smartest person in every room. But we're not here to gloat. Well, maybe a little, but mostly we're here to make sure you understand the full scope of what you pulled off. Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. This was about proving yourself right. It was about validating your intuition that screamed warnings they tried to silence. It was about honoring your instincts that saw through performances they thought were Oscar-worthy. It was about trusting yourself even when trusting yourself meant standing completely alone. And that self-trust you built in the dark while they were laughing in the light, that's the foundation everything else is built on now. They wanted you to second-guess every decision, to doubt every move, to question every choice until you were paralyzed by indecision and dependent on their approval. That was the goal. Keep you small. Keep you uncertain. Keep you seeking validation from people who would only validate you if it benefited them. But somewhere in the mess, somewhere in the mistakes they thought were destroying you, you stopped asking for permission. You stopped seeking consensus. You stopped needing their stamp of approval on your life. And the moment you did that, the moment you became your own authority, their power over you evaporated like the illusion it always was. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the question that's probably burning in your mind. Was it worth it? Was all that pain, all that judgment, all that isolation, all those moments where you genuinely questioned yourself, was it worth it to end up here? And the answer is so obvious it hurts. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because you didn't just survive their scrutiny, you transcended it. You didn't just prove them wrong, you made their wrongness irrelevant. You didn't just recover from the bait you set, you evolved because of it. Every hook they swallowed changed you in ways they'll never comprehend because they're still choking on their assumptions while you're breathing rarefied air they can't reach. Here's the part that's going to sting them the most when they finally realize it. And trust me, they will realize it in those quiet moments when their ego stops screaming long enough for truth to whisper. You never needed to beat them. You never needed revenge. You never needed to expose them publicly or destroy them systematically. All you needed to do was become yourself fully, unapologetically, completely. And in doing that, in becoming the person they tried so hard to prevent you from becoming, you didn't just win. You made the game they were playing obsolete. You leveled up so far beyond their comprehension that their opinions became background noise in a life they can't even imagine living. They're stuck, replaying the tape, analyzing where they went wrong, trying to figure out the exact moment you slipped through their fingers. Was it when you stopped responding to their bait? Was it when you stopped explaining yourself? Was it when you stopped showing up to arguments they started? Was it when you stopped caring about being understood by people who were committed to misunderstanding you? The truth is, it was all of those moments and none of them. Because the real moment they lost you was the moment you decided your peace was more valuable than their presence. That was the moment the hook set. That was the moment they swallowed the bait. That was the moment everything changed, even though it looked like nothing was happening. And now here's where we get to the really delicious part. The part that makes all of this worth documenting. They have to live with the knowledge that everything they thought about you was wrong. Every prediction they made failed. Every judgment they passed was premature. Every conclusion they drew was based on incomplete data because they never had access to the full picture. They were watching the trailer and writing reviews of the movie. They were reading the first chapter and critiquing the entire book. They were seeing the bait and thinking it was the whole fishing trip. And now the trip is over. The boat has left the dock, and they're standing on the shore realizing they were never actually invited in the first place. Let me paint you a picture of their present reality because you deserve to see what your strategy accomplished. They're watching you now, not with the confidence they had before, but with confusion and something that looks uncomfortably like respect mixed with resentment. They're seeing you thrive in ways they predicted you'd fail. They're seeing you surrounded by real ones after they said you'd end up alone. They're seeing you peaceful after they bet on you being broken. And every single day that you continue to rise, continue to build, continue to exist in a state of wholeness they said was impossible, it's a reminder of how spectacularly they misread you. They wanted front row seats to your downfall, and instead they got front row seats to your renaissance. They wanted to witness your collapse, and instead they're witnessing your coronation. They wanted to say they knew you when, implying you were once something significant and now you're not. But instead, they have to choke on. They knew you when you were planting seeds. They were too blind to see, would become forests. And that reversal, that complete inversion of their expectations, that's what happens when you use their underestimation as fertilizer and their doubt as fuel. You don't just prove them wrong, you make their wrongness a historical record they can't erase. But let's get real about something important, because this isn't just a victory lap, this is a masterclass. The bait you set wasn't malicious, it wasn't manipulative in the toxic sense, it was protective. It was your survival instinct, recognizing that not everyone who claims to love you actually does. Not everyone who smiles in your face wants to see you smile. Not everyone who asks how you're doing actually wants you to be doing well. And instead of wasting years trying to convince yourself otherwise, instead of giving endless chances to people who showed you exactly who they were, you created situations where their true nature had no choice but to reveal itself. That's not manipulation, that's wisdom. That's not playing games, that's playing chess while they're playing checkers. That's not being fake, that's being strategic about who gets access to the real you. Because the real you, the full you, the unguarded you, that's sacred. That's not for everyone. That's not for people who only want you around when you're useful. That's not for people who only support you when it doesn't threaten their ego. That's not for people who only celebrate you when your wins don't make them feel like losers. The real you is reserved for people who earned it by being real themselves. And the bait helped you separate the real from the fraudulent with surgical precision. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds cold. This sounds calculated. This sounds like you're giving yourself too much credit for things that just happened. But here's what you need to understand. Conscious or unconscious, planned or instinctive, the result is the same. You created circumstances where truth had to surface. You made space for reality to reveal itself. And whether you did that with a detailed plan or just by following your gut doesn't matter. What matters is you trusted yourself enough to see what was happening, to recognize the patterns, to connect the dots that they thought were random when they were actually coordinates leading you exactly where you needed to go. They thought your mistakes were evidence of your inadequacy, but they were evidence of your evolution. They thought your struggles meant you were failing, but they meant you were filtering. They thought your vulnerability was a weakness to exploit, but it was a test they failed miserably. And the most poetic part of all this, the cherry on top of this beautifully orchestrated karma, is that they did it to themselves. You didn't force them to judge you. You didn't force them to abandon you. You didn't force them to reveal their true colors. You just stopped hiding yours long enough for theirs to show up in contrast. You just stopped performing long enough for their performance to become obvious. And that's the real power move they'll